So, welcome everyone. We had some technical problems, that's why we're a little bit late, but now I think that we can start. So welcome to the seminar of the research platform Disability Studies in Eastern Europe Reconfigurations. My name is Monika Kwaściewska-Mikuła and I'm representing the organizing team today. And before we start today's seminar, I would like to invite you to our conference. It will be a big 2 days event that will take place in Krakow in May from 16 to 17. We are waiting for your proposals until January 10. And you can find a link to all the information and the submission form in the chat. Okay, now I think I can start today's seminar, which is of course the last seminar this year, but we will be back in February 2024. Today's seminar is titled Monstrosity, Visuality, Disability in Alternative Comics. We will first be listening to the lecture by José Alaniz from the University of Washington, and then we will have a discussion. The curator and host of today's seminar is Monika Świerkosz, who has been a member of our platform from the very beginning. She will introduce our guest and lead the discussion. So let me first introduce her. Monika Świerkosz is Associate Professor in Literature Studies at the Jagiellonian University. Okay, I have to... in Krakow. She works in the field of literature theory in conjunction with gender studies, critical theory, disability studies, and post-human studies. She's a founding member of the Critical Questions Research Group and editor-in-chief of the academic journal The Polylogue. Monika Świerkosz is the author of 2 monographs as well as the co-editor of Critical Constellation series. And she also collaborated as a scientific consultant and dramaturgical assistant in the 2 performances. And now I think, Monika, you can start if you don't have the technical problem still.
Yes. Thank you very much, Monika. And sorry, I really apologize to you for not being seen, but somehow on my computer, a camera doesn't work, and on my phone, microphone doesn't work. So I choose rather to be heard than seen by you, but really sorry, I can send you my picture just to make, yes, but later. At the moment, I really would like to start with saying a few words about our today's guest. But first of all, thank you for attending today's seminar in this busy pre-Christmas period. And thank you to our research team for helping me organizing this event. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today. José Alaniz is a professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He has published 3 monographs, Comic Art in Russia 2010, Death, Disability and the Superhero, The Silver Age and Beyond 2014, and Resurrection, Comics in Post-Soviet Russia 2022. He has also co-edited 2 essay collections, Comics of the New Europe, Reflections and Intersections, 2020, and Uncanny Bodies, Disability and Superhero Comics, 2019. He formerly chaired the executive committee of the International Comic Art Forum and was a founding board member of the Comics Studies Society. He's not only a prominent researcher in the field of comic studies and disability studies, but also a writer and a comic artist. He has published 3 comics prose collections entitled The Phantom Zone and Other Stories, 2020, The Complete Moscow Calling, 2023, and European True Fictions, 2023. His current scholarly book projects include very interesting topic, Comics of the Anthropocene, Graphic Narrative at the End of Nature. José, thank you for accepting our invitation. And the topic of your talk is Monstrosity, Visuality, Disability in Alternative Comics. The lecture will last for about 70 minutes, I think, and then we'll see if we need like 5 minutes of break, after which we will invite you to an open discussion. And not to prolong this, José, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and obviously for the organizers. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be zooming in from the west coast of the United States, where it is now about 8 in the morning. And I know that it is evening for you, and that there is obviously the weekend that is beginning. So I will be speaking, hopefully not quite for 70 minutes, but maybe most of that. And then I'm looking forward to your reaction and your and the conversation. I'm going to try to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Okay, if we have any issues, please let me know. I'm going to try to share it in full screen mode, if I may. Let's see. Maybe not. Maybe I'll just keep it there. That might be simpler. Zoom sometimes has all sorts of other issues with it. I'm sorry, just a minute. Okay, I'm trying to share it. Hopefully that is more or less clear to you. So yes, my topic is monstrosity, visuality, disability in alternative comics. And what I want to talk about today is a bit of an ongoing project. I have been fascinated by the intersections of monstrosity studies and disability studies for a long time. I mean, I think this is something that has been investigated by a number of scholars, and very prominently Margaret Shildrick. In terms of how some of these issues and how some of these concepts regarding monstrosity and disability studies get expressed in comics, that's an area that has been mainly relegated to graphic medicine, I would say, with what I would also argue is often more of a medical gaze, very often. But there is more fascinating work, I think, that's happening in that area. And so mine is a bit of a contribution, I think, to some of these debates about how we can look at the particular contribution of graphic narrative comics and visual culture, I think, and more generally towards a consideration of the monstrous in the rubric of disability studies. So yes, as my introducers were saying, I have worked in this area primarily in the realm of superhero comics, with 2 of the books that I've been behind have looked in particular in the question of genre and how that informs disability representations. I've done less work in alternative comics, at least in terms of what I have published. So this is in some respects kind of trying to look at that side of comics culture, the so-called alternative autobiographical works, nonfiction works, works that are dealing with questions of history and historical trauma in particular. And so that's really what I'm looking at today. It has become pretty standard in discussions of monstrosity to look at etymology and to look at least in the Romance languages and in languages like English as well, to look at the provenance of the word monster, and often it will be pointed out that it has all sorts of different connotations and different ways of looking at the word that relegate things like portent or prodigy, the question of warning. All of these, of course, harken back to the supernatural kind of manifestations of this term, the understandings of it related to vision and to sight, to something that is in many ways a disruption of the visual field, and that's one thing that I really want to focus on in this talk. So that's about all I wanted to do with that slide. The other thing that I think, just to give us a little bit of a roadmap of what I am trying to do in this talk, is to delve into the question of visuality and the visual impact of the monster, given that comics is primarily a visual medium, and it is subject to some of the same limitations as other visual media when discussing questions like difference. The other is the ways in which, as other scholars like Jeffrey Jerome Cohen or Margaret Shildrick in particular talk about monstrosity and difference as manifestations of abjection, and how identity formation often is carried out through the abjection of certain undesired or stigmatized physical differences or mental differences. And so the question for me, as Cohen puts it, of the body as pure culture, as both something that is a kind of cultural construct, as well as something that has great, very, very deep roots in understandings of biology and morphology. These are questions that I'm going to explore kind of more further, and obviously the questions of stigma. How these questions relate to notions of contagion and infection and impurity, obviously going all the way back to somebody like Mary Douglas and Purity and Danger. These questions are always, I think, revolving around the notion of the monster, and consequently, I think, notions of disability as well, and disability stigma. Mikhail Bakhtin has also been useful for me to think about the notions of bodies as unfinalizable and ultimately unregulable in a broad sense, and that's I think one of the things that's also touching on this way of thinking for me. And then finally, the notion, also very much owing to figures like Rosemary Garland Thompson and Margaret Shildrick, the notion of the monster as a kind of challenge to human moral or corporeal categories. And so these are all, I think, very basic ways of approaching the monster historically, certainly in the last 20, 30 years. So let me move on. Okay, so again, not to hit you with too many slides full of quotations, but let me just start by some of the ways, particularly like some of the European historians and disability studies scholars have I think looked at some of these questions in ways that I think are useful, and maybe ways that we can also push back against. So it's somebody like Henri Jacques Stiquet, for example, writes, "What I thought I knew well, me, the other, what I had confidence in, what reassured me is revealed as completely different. An unexpected, invisible aspect of reality looms up here and now and suddenly constitutes a threat without appeal. This is what we call a catastrophe. A catastrophe ensues from the fact that I didn't know reality could give birth to that. I had built myself a world where I had not anticipated that such a difference, such a particularity could spring out. In other words, alterity has surfaced from under a difference that cannot be situated." So really emphasizing here, particularly the question of the catastrophic nature of the monster as a figure that upends, that inverts the standard protocols, and that is a direct challenge to corporeal sense of stability. This is also something that we see in scholars like Georges Canguilhem, who talks about the monster in similar terms. We must reserve the qualification monster for organic beings, he mentions. Now, the monster is not only a living being of reduced value, it is a living being whose value is to be counterpoint. By revealing the precariousness of the stability to which life has habituated us, yes, merely habituated, even though we have turned this habit into a law, the monster bestows upon the repetition of species, upon morphological regularity, and upon successful structuration, a value all the more eminent in that we can now grasp their contingency. The vital counter-value is thus not death, but monstrosity. And again, for me, the value of this sort of this way of discussing the monster is that it is a kind of a reminder. It is a memento mori. It is something that is a kind of a wake up, a kind of jolt to the habitus, to the ways of thinking in conventional terms about bodies and what bodies mean. They're a reminder of contingency or precarity and of instability, right? and of becoming into something else. And so that again, the monster, I think, represents a kind of limit case for these sorts of for these ways of thinking. Okay, and then that brings us to the questions of visuality that I want to explore. I think that Rosemary Garland Thompson's work on the visual rhetorics of disability in popular photography, I think was a fascinating essay. And it was, in fact, one of the essays that first got me very, very much interested in pursuing disability studies when I was a graduate student. And so it is, I think it's still an essay that continues to fuel a lot of my own thinking on disability and visuality. What very useful ways in which Rosemary Garland Thompson talks about disability in visual culture is in a sense to talk about the disabled figure as to be looked at rather than to be in. There's always of a distance, of a gap between the beholder and the disabled figure. There's always separation between them. Consequently, the visual, whether it is looking toward or looking away, is the major mode that defines disability in modernity. Again, right, this notion of the disabled figure as a kind of disruption of the visual field, a kind of explosion of difference in the usual way of doing things. The examples we can turn to are like Joseph Merrick, as he was known in his own life in the 19th century, the Elephant Man, and the way that these medical photographs circulate in the press, and the ways in which the body as something that is being highlighted here as a disruption, and that's being contrasted, right? That's being very much emphasized, these photographs, by posing a very ordinary, almost domestic sort of scene with the carpets, with the curtains, with the furniture there. It only in a sense emphasizes his physical difference. I hope you all can still hear me. Okay. As Garland Thompson puts it, by positioning the disabled figure as the exception to human capability rather than the rule, the wondrous estranges the viewer from the viewed, attenuating the correspondence that equality requires. So that there's a fundamentally undemocratic and non-egalitarian way in which this privileging of the visual in terms of assessing the disabled figure is here, and that's part she's talking about there in her what she calls the visual rhetoric of the wondrous. These are a category of disabled body that is particularly tied to questions of the supernatural, to questions of augury, of portents, and in short, I would argue of monstrosity. I don't think she uses that term in particular, but that's, I think, largely what she is talking about. Joseph Merrick is a kind of monstrous figure that is contradictory and paradoxical, because it is also a sympathetic figure, a very sentimentalized figure in Victorian England as well. Okay, so all of this is also another way of talking about related critical concepts in particularly in cinema studies. And here I'm talking about Tom Gunning's aesthetic of astonishment. This is a concept that he's deriving partly from Sergei Eisenstein earlier in the 20th century. But the idea that there are moments and there are figures within cinema representation, like the disabled figure, right, that are themselves disruptive of conventional narratology. This is what he means. Rather than being an involvement with narrative action or empathy with character psychology, the cinema of attractions solicits a highly conscious awareness of the film image, engaging in the viewer's curiosity. This cinema addresses and holds the spectator, emphasizing the act of display. In fulfilling this curiosity, it delivers a generally brief dose of scopic pleasure. Now, Gunning is usually, he's discussing mostly things like action sequences or in some cases, the female figure, like a Marilyn Monroe, this idea of scopic pleasure. I'm extending that idea also to discuss questions of the disabled figure, the disabled kind of astonishment. And I think, again, The Elephant Man, both the actual person as well as the movie that David Lynch releases in the late 70s is I think emblematic of this aesthetic of astonishment, the uses of the disabled figure to disrupt business as usual and the visual field. Okay, so what I turn to now, and again, I hope you all can still hear me okay, and that you are patient with my walking through just some of these general concepts in a very stream of consciousness way. What I wanted to talk about now are some of the inspirations for this line of thinking. So what I'm trying to do is share with you a video, if I can do that. Okay. Okay. Just a second. It's okay. You should be seeing a wait. You should be you should be seeing a video screen. Is that okay? Can someone?
No, it's still in the presentation. The previous.
It's still on the presentation.
Yeah.
It's not on a video. Okay, let me try to share again. Okay, is that it? You should see a screen that says Dove Sketches or Gov Beauty Sketches.
Yes,
Real Beauty
now
Sketches.
it works.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to try to play it. This is about 3 minutes long. This is an ad campaign that was promoted by Dove, which is a major soap company and beauty products company. And so I wanted to just, I'm sorry, there's just a lot of clutter on my screen. Okay, hopefully this is working.
I'm a forensic artist, worked for the San Jose Police Department from 1995 to 2011.
I showed up to a place I'd never been, and there was a guy with a drafting board. We couldn't see them, they couldn't see us.
Tell me about your hair.
I didn't know what he was doing, but then I could tell after several questions that he was drawing me.
Tell me about your chin.
It kind of protrudes a little bit, especially when I smile.
Your jaw.
My mom told me I had a big jaw.
What would be your most prominent feature?
Kind of have a fat, rounder face.
The older I've gotten, the more freckles I've gotten.
I would say I have a pretty big forehead.
Once I get a sketch, I say thank you very much, and then they leave. I don't see them.
All I had been told before the sketch was to get friendly with this other woman, Chloe.
Today, I'm going to ask you some questions about a person you met earlier, and I'm going to ask you some general questions about their face.
She was thin, so you could see her cheekbones. And her chin, it was a nice, thin chin.
She had nice eyes. They lit up when she spoke.
Cute nose.
Blue eyes, very nice blue eyes.
So here we go. This is the sketch that you helped me create. And that's a sketch that somebody described of you.
So yeah, that's.
She looks closed off and fatter, sadder too. The second one looks more open, friendly, and happy.
I should be more grateful of my natural beauty. It impacts the choices and the friends that we make, the jobs we apply for, how we treat our children. It impacts everything. It couldn't be more critical to your happiness.
Do you think you're more beautiful than you say?
Yeah. Yeah.
We spend a lot of time as women analyzing and trying to fix the things that aren't quite right. And we should spend more time appreciating the things that we do like.
Okay, stop it there. Let me switch back. Okay, bear with me. Okay, you should have my slides again, I hope.
Yes, that's right.
All right, thank you. So if you saw, if that came through, the campaign was run in 2013, and what struck me about it, right, besides the very overt sentimentality and the very hazy kind of photography and the very calming music, was of course the sentiments that were being expressed, and about these two different drawings that are produced by the artist. One of them, in a sense, kind of representing a kind of flawed or defective or wrong version of the person, and the other one reflecting supposedly their inner state and their inner beauty. That what I found to be kind of really disturbing about this campaign was how it was very much looking at physical characteristics as denoting interiority, or denoting a kind of permission to enter the social sphere, versus another that was not, right. And so it's this kind of thing that I think is fascinating, the ways in which the so-called negative sketch is kind of monstrous distortion of the way that it is highlighting non-conventional, quote unquote, kind of aspects of a person. But the other thing, of course, is that it is there are still people who are going to look like these so-called negative sketches, and the ways in which it is dividing for these women, and frankly, I think preying on their insecurities and their anxieties about their looks. And this was a theme that was picked up by a number of feminist commentators at the time, like Kate Friedkiss, who writes that, interestingly, even the sketches based on descriptions weren't actually particularly unattractive, she writes, and I was faintly annoyed with the idea that one sketch was supposed to represent unattractiveness and the other beauty, when the distinctions between the two seem to lie in characteristics like a mole, shadows under the eyes, slight roundness and facial shadows, et cetera, et cetera. So it is, I think, a really, unnerving and even maybe even partly eugenicist sort of way of thinking that that some of these characteristics are to be applauded and celebrated and accepted, and others are somehow illegitimate or wrong in some way. And I think Friedkes is picking up on that idea that that maybe that there's a big problem underlying that way of thinking and that way of separation and that way of categorization of people. And it leads me to questions about really about abjection and about monstrosity that I think are very germane when we discuss the comics that I will be discussing. This is my second inspiration, and this is from a documentary called Code of the Freaks that was put together by a number of disability and other scholars. In 2020, I'm going to again try to share that brief clip with you. And give me a second here. This one is a much shorter clip. So this is an interview with the Chicago artist Riva Lair that I want to highlight maybe here. I'm sorry. I'm going to try it again. Sorry about that. My apologies. I seem to have, oh, here it is. Okay. I think I have it. Okay. Please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to play a bit here, right about there. This is an interview with the artist Riva Lair.
They are shunned and ashamed until cured. As paragons, they suffer greatly and are therefore closer to God.
I do remember seeing Heidi a number of times. There was like, you know, the Saturday afternoon matinee. I must have watched that every single time it came on. I wasn't looking for any reflection of myself in any TV or movies. I think that's why I started watching a lot of sort of horror and fantasy and very, you know, super imaginative worlds. I'm pretty obsessed with Frankenstein, and particularly the Bride of Frankenstein. I actually collect the Bride of Frankenstein. She's all over the place. And she's been the closest to an avatar that I've had. I loved those movies. I loved seeing him because I thought his shoes were like mine, and I've had several dozen surgeries, and I think Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein were the two characters that I really did feel close to. And I would cry my way through both movies every single time. When I've seen movies with characters with disabilities, it's been usually one of two things. The ones that come to mind are pretty disabled women who are desirable despite their disability, which normally was being blind. You can be so pretty.
Okay, and she goes on to discuss other things, but it was particularly this attention being paid to the monstrous figure, the identification by a disabled person with figures like Frankenstein. That again, right? It almost seems like the inverse, the reverse of what we call with the Dove Beauty campaign, where it's precisely the difference and precisely the monstrosity, and even to some extent, I would say outside the stigmatized figure that becomes the object of identification, and again, it's those two kind of things that I think are in a kind of dialogue with each other. This brings me then to the question of monstrosity and comics. And again, I ask for your patience. These are all thoughts that are still coming together in my head. The project is still kind of coming together in general. So some of this will be very ad hoc. But if we're going to talk about monstrosity in comics, right, and this brings me to there is, of course, a very defined lineage, a very rich legacy and history of looking at grotesque figures and monstrous figures in comics, very often in subversive and humorous ways, as we may know. And so certainly a figure like Basil Wolverton, who is a prominent artist, particularly for Mad magazine in the middle of the 20th century, and the ways in which the question of beauty, femininity, and I would argue even whiteness are being parodied through the monstrous figure. This is a direct parody, by the way, of a cover from Life magazine that was around at the time, and so mocking the notions of the beauty pageant, of the beauty queen, of conventional feminine beauty, all of those things that the Dove commercial, the beauty campaign is sort of highlighting and reviving, I think, in the 21st century. These are all objects of scorn and of fun for Wolverton. And it's by taking that those illegitimate, those abjected qualities of those exaggerated features of the body, and highlighting them and turning them into something fun and ridiculous and absurd. That is very much the coin of the realm for so much of what Mad magazine was doing in this example. Just as a side note, of course, this was not the first time that Wolverton had used it. There's a direct line of this sort of material that goes back to the comic strips where he first used the figure Lena the hyena in the 40s. And so what I wanted to also is other ways in which monstrosity is utilized in alternative comics, particularly in graphic memoirs, in ways that are both subversive, but also, again, getting more into the identificatory mode that we saw with Code of the Freaks and the Riva Lair interview. And I turn to the work of Thomas Kauser here in Signifying Bodies, where he talks about the ways in which disability intersects with the Gothic in ways that I think very much evoke monstrosity here. As he mentions, a rhetoric frequently employed in the representation of disability is the rhetoric of horror, Gothic rhetoric, which derives, of course, from the fictional genre that so often features disfigured, deformed, or maimed characters. Here, disability is characterized as a literally dreadful condition to be shunned or avoided. At first, Gothic rhetoric encouraged revulsion from disability, at best pity for the affected. Such rhetoric might seem unlikely to be used in the first-person discourse, such as disability memoir, where it would reflect negativity on the author-narrator, but the deterrent vanishes when impairment is corrected or transcended. From this standpoint of those who are cured or rehabilitated, or otherwise destigmatized themselves, it is common to look back upon a period of disability as a Gothic horror, where they represent their former condition as grotesque. Now, that's certainly true as far as that goes, but there are, of course, there are other ways in which the Gothic informs the identity formation of figures that people who even don't necessarily transcend and come to a level of acceptance of their disability. So what I think what Kauser is partly talking about is the notion of disability as monstrosity and as the grotesque and as something that is sort of haunting normality one way or the other. And that, of course, gets used a great deal in horror throughout the 20th century. And that this is, I think, very much typical. A very typical example would be Bruce Jones and Bernie Wrightson's horror story Jennifer, from 1974, published in a very popular horror comic of that era. And what's particularly, I think, important is the ways, as you can see in the panels, the ways that the figure is being highlighted, is being zoomed in on. You're being given a very, very clear a view of the figure, almost a kind of a close-up, right? An intimate sort of close-up. In addition, you notice how the monster, in a sense, ruptures not only the visual field, but in a sense the linguistic field as well, in that the name of this figure, Jennifer, is misspelled, right? The name Jennifer typically has two N's, and so Jennifer in this story only has one. And so there is this almost a kind of linguistic as well as really almost ontological sort of difference that is being inserted into the realm of the everyday. That, of course, is the very modus operandi of horror and the Gothic in general, right? However, right, there is this other mode, and this is where I want to relate it more to what I've been talking about already in terms of identity formation. a very celebrated graphic memoir, The Spiral Cage by Al Davison from the UK. He first publishes it in 1988 and it is republished in 2003. Deals with his growing up, actually several years that he spent in a hospital because of his spina bifida, his deformity of the spine and the legs. And it is in the hospital that he learns to read, and he starts reading books like Frankenstein. And it is in this page, I think, that you see, I think, some of the real power of this metaphorization of the disabled figure, the grotesque, monstrous figure, as a way of self-understanding. As he puts it here, as the young Al is reading in 1964 in his hospital room, I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions. I was horrified with myself in a transparent pool. This is a quote from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that he's reading. I started able to believe that I was indeed it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror, and when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. And then Al puts the book down and asks his nurse, what does despondence and mortification mean? And there's that wonderful image of his legs there in shadow, in a sense, kind of redirecting our gaze to consider the object of what it is that makes him like Frankenstein's monster, that makes him, in a sense, a sort of monstrous figure himself. So it is again the graphic, these sorts of uses of the monstrous figure, ultimately for a kind of transcendent aims, for a kind of identification with the monster and a kind of incorporation of these stigmatized characteristics into a more whole sense of self. And so it's I think a wonderful kind of early example of this kind of usage of monstrosity in the disability memoir. The one of my main case studies that I want to look at now, one of two, is Monsters, then by Ken Dahl, which I think is doing some of what we see in Al Davison, and I think getting at a lot of many notions of stigma, and particularly sexually transmitted diseases, and how that impacts masculine identity in particular. And Al Davison's also very much interested in exploring questions of masculinity as a disabled person. So Ken Dahl, his real name is Gabby Schultz, releases this quasi-autobiographical educational comics work in 2009, Monsters, and it's essentially dealing with his life with herpes. And there are some graphic images here that I should let you know about. The narrator, as he is trying to keep his herpes diagnosis, because he thinks that it will doom his chances as a love interest. And so there's all sorts of ways in which Ken Dahl is rounded figures which represent the virus, kind of basically contaminating and rupturing borders all over there. As you can see in this image, the narrator has a big O, or a big hole in the middle of his abdomen there, obviously representing, it represents a lot of things. It represents guilt. It represents a sense of needing to keep everything hidden, not revealing who he is, but then how corrosive that is to his relationship, and how very often through this metaphor of the monster, we have it transformed into this disgusting giant virus sort of figure. Ken Dahl is doing a lot of things here in terms of just using, like Basil Wolverton with his cover of the Mad magazine, which is a parody of the Life magazine. We can see here how he's utilizing a lot of familiar techniques that come from other genres. I would specifically here cite the use of the Incredible Hulk and the transformation of Bruce Banner into the Hulk from superhero comics here as over 4 panels as a particular kind of illusion here. And so just to get what that looks like, this is from the very first Hulk comic book from 1962, which also uses a number of panels over which we see transformation of a normal person into a monster here. So I think Ken Dahl is utilizing a lot of that parodically in all sorts of productive ways in the memoir. The other thing that we also need to I think keep in mind is that is also on a very basic level, it's an educational comic. It's a comic that is very teaching the reader what herpes is and how it spreads and what it means. And in that sense, it is very much owing to this other tradition in comics, which is the underground comics of the 60s and 70s, like Slow Death from Last Gasp Press, which also took it upon itself to do a comic book on herpes, as it happens, in 1979. And it also partakes of a very graphic, very frank sort of discussion of sexually transmitted diseases and their effect. Right. So what he is here is exploring the profound insecurities and instabilities and anxieties through the monster figure, right? It is a visualization of his own sexual hang-ups and his own basically disintegrating sense of masculine dominance, particularly over women, and a lot of it is also just his own misogyny that he is confessing to. As he puts it here, let's face it, no one wants to fuck a monster and become a monster themselves. But look at it from the monster's point of view. You just want what everyone else wants: acceptance, affection, inclusion, and of course, survival. Just for that, your life is to be a gauntlet of pretty faces recoiling in horror. So again, right, you can see here in this page, he is utilizing the monster contagion kind of mode here, derived from things like zombie movies, for example, or vampire movies, as well as here in the bottom portion of the page, a conventional sort of normal, quote unquote, looking woman was reeling in horrors, very much trope coming out of horror movies and horror narratives. And basically there's all of that. So this is another example of the contagion narrative and how that's tied into his questions of his own conscience and guilt. But there's another moment in the memoir where he switches into a completely different mode, a hyper-realist, photorealist mode, where he is depicting the real effects of herpes symptoms on human bodies, particularly genitalia and lips, as you can see here. And so very much, I think, acts a different mode of the abject and the monstrous through the medicalized gaze, which is again quite a shock when you're reading this memoir, and most of it is very cartoony and very funny throughout of it in a very kind of disturbing way, and then you come to this section, which is obviously calculated to in a sense to explode, again, disrupt the visual field through this completely different approach. Here's a couple of the other examples of the effects of herpes. Ultimately, we have the narrator transforming fully into a monster that is not only physically repulsive, but also a kind of moral, morally monstrous figure, is only using women for pleasure rather than kind of keeping their safety in mind, because of course he is spreading the virus, or feels that he is. Ultimately, though, and again, I encourage all of y'all don't know this memoir to read it on your own, but what we come to by the end of is a sense of a kind of stasis, a sense of reconciliation with the virus, who, as you can see, has now been reduced to a very almost friendly little creature, almost like a little gremlin or something, and basically a way of acceptance of the monstrosity within him, as the virus tells him, I'm just another life form trying to survive in this weird, fucked up world. We have a little beat in that second panel, and then he pats him and says, "I know, little buddy." So again, right, this is very much Ken Dahl's usage of a particular kind of comedic tempo in comics that is ultimately Schultz that were masters of this sort of thing. So by, in a sense, reducing the drama of the herpes diagnosis and the ways in which he feels he's a kind of contaminating monster that is infecting all of the world, to in a sense kind of reduce all of that to the banality and the normality ultimately of the monsters within him, right? And the fact that, you know, we're all kind of trans corporeal beings that are, you know, with our borders being very porous and not being obviously firm, it is all of that I think it helps us to arrive to a point of acceptance and a kind of a new kind of identity, if you will. So it's in a sense the dialectic of all of those things that play out over the course of the memoir, and it ends in that sort of light. I realize that I might be taking a little bit more time than I should, so I'll try to go a little bit faster. I did want to turn now to my second case study, which is looking at historical trauma and disability in Elephants in Marienbad by Jan Baban and Wojtek Maszek. So this is an example from the Czech Republic, and I'm very aware, of course, and very sad about the tragic shooting that happened in Prague yesterday. But it casts a shadow over some of what I'm going to say, I think. But what we see in Slony v Marienbadu, or Elephants in Marienbad by Baban and Maszek, is a fascinating work of comics and photography and an evocation of historical trauma through the comics medium that is also relentlessly experimental, since Baban and Maszek actually come from FAMU, and they're trained in that School of Film and TV and the School of the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague. They come to comics, I think, fairly late in their career, and they're fascinated with using it in all sorts of unconventional ways. And in this Damian Hobot trilogy, they are particularly interested in utilizing comics for an exploration of 20th century historical trauma in Czechoslovakia, particularly the Warsaw Pact invasion of 1968 and its aftermath, which is, of course, a major traumatic pivot in Czech history. I'm particularly Harry Earle and her work on comics and trauma. And so here I think we have another way of looking at the way that the monstrous can get utilized, not just for personal trauma, the way that Ken Dahl is using it in Monsters, but for historical trauma, for things that affect whole nations. And so Earle mentions here, I think, an important point about the way that form is very much a part of the that is something that we need to keep in mind, the way that comics form is itself affected by this sort of subject matter. In Comics of Conflict and Trauma, she writes, the effects of traumatic experience are created in the formal techniques of the comic. The comic's creator has a range of devices that the traditional writer does not. In order to demonstrate the interplay between the comic's form and trauma theory, there is a need to analyze different formal aspects and consider how the transformative nature of the traumatic rupture, for all of trauma theory, agree that trauma is a transformative experience, affects the creation of the narrative. I think this insight is tailor-made for something like Elephants in Marienbad, given that it is a relentlessly experimental work. Obviously, branch that I explore is, and this is nothing I need to tell an audience of Eastern Europeans, right? But as merely the ways in which the Russian invasion, or the Warsaw Pact invasion, is basically seen as a Russian invasion, an expansion, an imperialist sort of Russian project, is of course a major kind of modal point for Czech identity going forward. The ways in which, as he puts it, the Russian invasion throws Czechoslovakia into a post-cultural era, leaving it naked and defenseless before the Russian army. A lot of this, of course, has been revisited in a big way in Slavic studies in the United States since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But there's a very, very similar kind of discourse being explored in Elephants in Marienbad. So this is what it looks like. And so, as you can see, Baban and Maszek are using photographs that then they relentlessly treat over and over. They work them over with all sorts of analog, some digital methods. And so you can see a kind of almost like a kind of photo novel that you can that elicits a sense of dread that is always, in a sense, breaking apart the conventional comics design that we see in most works, and ultimately another kind of invasion, a kind of medicalized invasion, whereby the Soviets are coming to Czechoslovakia to to basically transform the Czechs, the Czechoslovaks, into this new form of body through attaching trunks, right, hoboti, to their faces, whereby they will basically carry on revolutionary progress to a next stage of evolution. And so, as you can see, they're utilizing some propaganda materials and photographs and all sorts of other stuff. So it's a very eclectic, very, very much of a kind of hodgepodge, a patchwork of images here that they utilize. The comrade engineer Trunkov or Hobotov from the Stalinist Soviet Union is the one who performs the trunkification, or hobotizace, as they call it. And again, the whole notion of transformation, physical transformation, of how the Russian invasion is being written physically on the bodies of the local population. You can compare it, for example, to something like Charles Burns's Black Hole from 2000, where I only compare it because we have similar kind of pages that are being used here. Black Hole, of course, is another famous graphic narrative about contagion and about mutation and monstrosity. But getting back to Baban and Masik's work, we see here the Damian Hobot, the protagonist, being mocked or being noted. Again, a disruption of the visual field here as he's walking through the streets of Prague, and people notice his trunk, and automatically he comes to realize that he's not being seen as some kind of advancement of human progress and evolution, but rather as a kind of monstrous figure, a freak, in short. And there's a number of images that Frankenstein, which is a major trope for a lot of these narratives, as a very early and important monster, right, but a very sympathetic monster as well. The other kind of things that they draw on, of course, is the very, very mixed and heterogeneous associations that we have with elephant-human hybrids, especially things like Ganesh, from obviously from Hindu theology and mythology, as well as I already mentioned, Joseph Merrick on the Elephant Man. So these are all kind of basically threads that that Baban and Masik are drawing on for their story. But I think a much more direct reference, especially a visual reference here, goes imagery from the Soviet Union, the use of these gas masks that have these kind of extensions that look like trunks. And I think they're playing off of this, I think, in a very big way, as you can see here from these pictures from Soviet era gas drills. And I think even more specifically still, there's, I think, the most kind of direct and immediate reference that they are making, which is to the Chernobyl liquidators, those people who went into the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl and to try to quaff the fire after the explosion and try to prevent more radiation from leaking. A lot of these people, of course, as we know, were themselves irradiated and died from radiation poisoning. So again, right, it is that use of the so-called trunk here, of something that looks like a trunk, that they are, I think, want us to access. And so the idea of then implanting trunks onto these Czechoslovak people is itself already a kind of stamping of them with a kind of monstrosity and contagion and freakishness, I would say. All right, I'll go a little bit further along. This is there's another picture here you can see where there's, I think, a direct reference being made to the liquidators. I'll just go on a little bit faster. What also ends up happening is that the local doctor, Dr. Jena or Dr. Fem, in the English translation, is ultimately driven against the Soviets when they end up experimenting on his wife and producing a kind of full-fledged monster, as you can see in the bottom there. And so again, it is an example of the Soviet invasion, the Soviet influence, the Russian really influence on the Czech people that is seen as a sort of imposition, a kind of a perversion of their bodies and turning into the monster. So this is a tragic sort of outcome for them. So basically, right, in the upshot, we can say disfigured body as a metaphor of the lingering trauma of Russo-Soviet aggression against the Czech people is also a nationally tinged narrative prosthesis. And I'm using the term prosthesis from Mitchell and Snyder's famous work from over 30 years ago, where they note that the narrative prosthesis functions first and foremost as a stock feature. It is something that you use in narratives to sort of disability, the disabled body, to explain it, to, in a sense, sort of wish it away in a sense. And secondly, it can also be used as a metaphorical device, usually for stigmatizing ends. And I think part of what Baban and Mašek are doing, right, is that the trunk becomes this kind of stigmatizing feature and a physical feature denoting Sovietness, right? The Soviet aspects of living under the Soviet imperialism. That said, right, as the trilogy continues, and I don't much here, but what also makes it a narrative prosthesis in a different way, and maybe in a more affirming way, is that the trunk over the course of the trilogy takes on more and more supernatural and superheroic sort of aspects, so that by the end of it, Hobot is actually able to alter reality through the use of the trunk. So it is a fascinating, I think, way in which a fascinating evolution. And as Jean Baban, the screenwriter, puts it, he's a kind of anti-superhero compared to the American comic book tradition, a kind of Eastern Bloc superhero. His trunk has super skills. So we can, in a sense, maybe trace the development of this image of the narrative prosthesis of the trunk from a kind of Sovietized to maybe a post-Sovietized, post-socialist sort of way in which it is an inherited characteristic. The trauma, of course, is still there, but there's different ways to kind of approach it and incorporate it and, in a sense, accept it as a part of the self. So the monstrous, right, is in a sense a part of all of us and a part of the Czech state, if you will. Now, again, that might be a more problematic sort of way, but certainly the notions of trauma, historical trauma, and how it gets imprinted on the through the disabled figure is a central concern of this narrative. Okay, I'm trying to finish and get to my conclusion here, called Cripping the Monster. There's a number of things I think we can consider now as we go closer to the present and maybe into the future of what we see with disability identity. I'm particularly drawn, for example, to something in Con website. Cripping the Con was a major disability popular culture convention and festival that happened in Syracuse, New York. It is now, it no longer exists, but it's been kind of repurposed into other things. And they were already talking about cripping as long ago as 2013. And this is not an academic audience necessarily, so it's become a very sort of more popularized usage of the term. Cripping is one way of taking back language and power from the people who and the institutions and systems that have used it historically, in some cases presently, to harm and demean people with disabilities. So, right, just like other historically marginalized communities, like queer people, for example. So cripping becomes this very useful term for taking back the reins of power, at least the being characterized here. There's something else, though, that comes from the horror studies scholar Maria Levina, who is actually originally from Russia. To the way that she talks about monstrosity is, I think particularly useful for the way that I've been thinking about it. She puts it, to me, monstrosity is fundamentally about intersectionality, and any sort of study of monstrosity to me that is worth a damn is acknowledges intersectionality in some way, shape, or form. Like, not every single monstrosity has to be about race, but it can't be just about one thing. It can't be just about sexuality. It can't be just about gender. It can't be just about race. It has to be about something broader. Otherwise, you're not capturing everything monstrosity is. And for Levina, monstrosity is by definition a kind of interdisciplinary sort of subject that you need to kind of access through, I think, a variety of media and a variety of approaches. And that's kind of what is informing this comment. With that in mind, I think we can look in particular at the work of Emile Ferris, another famous Chicago artist, particularly her autobiographical short story, The Bite That Changed My Life, which deals with her concept of her West Nile virus journey. So she was bitten by a diseased mosquito, and that leads to a journey to the hospital and basically the changing of her life. And this in particular, I think, is an important page here, where she provides us some self-portraits that she's drawing while she is still in her hospital bed, as you can see along the bottom there, but it's done with the help of her daughter. So I think community, interdependence, like help, right? Her daughter helping her to actually draw the things, and then eventually she's able to recover. The way in which this becomes an embedded part of this portrait, right? That earlier stage when she was barely able to hold a pen and needed to have it taped to her fingers, becomes a lasting imprint for a consideration of her identity. The ways in which she counterposes her own new disabled identity as a kind of countervailing force to something that seems to be almost a kind of hegemonic, bureaucratized sort of ideology of normality, as she puts it kind of here, and the ways in which she is depicting actually how difficult this journey actually really is, and the journey to self-acceptance. Now, all of this, I think, in a graphic novel, My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Volume 1, 2017, which is itself, I think, all about, in a sense, everything that I have been kind of talking about in this presentation, because it deals, in a sense, with the ways in which monstrosity is central to the idea, to the identity of the protagonist, Karen Reyes, who is not only a young girl, she's also a lesbian, she's also Latina, and all of these kind of aspects are being explored by Emile Ferris. The other way is how she presents herself, right? And again, we come back to form, the way that all of the pages, or most of the pages in My Favorite Thing is Monsters, are presented in the form of the drawings that Karen Reyes does in her notebook. And so we have all of these little, little holes there that are part of the paper, and we have the blue lines, we have the spiral wire along the right there. And again, the presentation of her as a kind of werewolf, which is her beloved kind of a cinematic monster, right? The Wolfman. That said, right, there is a number of points here where she is being forced to reconsider herself, even though she almost always portrays herself as the wolf girl. At moments where her brother forces her to basically consider that she is not a wolf girl, that this is what she really looks like as she stares into a mirror, is itself, I think, a very violent and very abusive kind of way in which we have that sort of sense of a hegemonic normality that is being imposed upon the figure. And so she does not identify with herself in this way, in this figure. She identifies with herself as the wolf girl, and all of the different kind of identity categories that accesses. You can see even in this portrait, right? She presents the portrait, but then she's got lines that are kind of running down. This is kind of like scratch outs where she's trying to eliminate that portrait of herself. This complete resistance to this image of herself that she sees as false and not truthful. Now, again, right, all of this brings us back to the question of monstrosity in popular culture, I think, in particular, and Ferris is very influenced by portraits like this by Basile Gogos, which were published not in museums or in the fine arts, but they were in popular monster magazines of the 60s and 70s, as you see here. But again, the way that there's a kind of valorization, a kind of iconicization a kind of adulation that comes here for the monster fan in these portraits, right, which are in their own way so they're quite beautiful in all sorts of ways, right, in the ways that they queer normality, which is basically what Karen is doing throughout My Favorite Thing is Monster. And so you can see in Emile Ferris's in the book itself how Karen draws these kinds of covers, and she makes a number of portraits like this of the monstrous, grotesque figures, which she clearly is very, very taken with and adores in all sorts of ways. That said, also again the constant threat of this imposition of a kind of hegemonic normality from outside. Whether it is this imagined mob that tries to kill the monster, and also these ways in which she herself has to come to terms with her own imagined transformations here. And again, here you have a transformation into the wolf character, which is being chased by a mob at the beginning of the novel. This is a direct allusion, by the way, to The Wolfman from 1941, the horror film with Lon Chaney, which she is very, very enamored of. And so, but again, I think the dialogue here is important as a refutation of any sense of the conventional. My bones got longer and cracked into new shapes, just like Larry Talbot in The Wolfman. My skin and ligaments got thick and stretched. My teeth grew out to be finger-long and jagged. The nightgown, which Mama was so proud of finding for a steal, had ripped to shreds. It was a shame because even though I had never liked the girly look of the nightie, I knew that Mama would be super disappointed because I hadn't taken good care of my things. Even though they were far away, I could sense the mob was getting closer and closer, right? So ripping a part of the nightgown, in a sense, kind of rejecting that human girl identity for this monstrous identity that is itself under threat by a mob. Okay, this is another, I think, good example where Karen takes an arithmetic test that she received a very poor grade on, and again, physically, visually into this visual field populated by monsters, and even a kind of romantic figure there with the hearts. All of that, again, also comes to a head because these kinds of imaginings and identifications with monstrosity are also on a whole other level a way for Karen to deal with the psychological and emotional blow that is represented by her mother's cancer. And of course, eventually her mother dies of cancer in the novel. And so as you can see here, there is all of these ways in which the trauma and the pain that she is going to is being embedded in the words onto the portrait of this very angry werewolf self-portrait, including her own trouble dealing with her mother's cancer. So it's all very, I think, kind of a fascinating figure that is combining notions of identity and monstrosity and disability with the effectual kind of modes and the ways in which stigma is being recalibrated, but not easily, right? It is never a stable and straightforward process. She also mentions monsters very explicitly, and even does what I did at the beginning of this presentation, the dictionary, as she puts it here. The dictionary says the word monster comes from the Latin word monstrum, which means to show, like to demonstrate, but the mob says we've never seen monsters, they can't be there, et cetera, that monsters exist under our noses, as she puts it. Internalizing of the monstrosity of the figure, of the grotesque within the self. And she highlights that by talking about her mother's unusual eye and its patch, that she says. And so there's a little bit of monster in everybody, as she puts it. All of this then in conclusion kind of puts me in mind of the work of a number of disabled artists, including Riva Lehrer, I cited earlier in her interview. Works like her portrait of Matt Fraser, the actor and performer, who in her portrait, Matt Fraser's CeeLo Seal Boy, that highlights, I think, the sense of a freak show, right? As you can see there from the torn curtains, and it's clearly a kind of her circus a sideshow kind of atmosphere, but also the dignity, the facing forward of the figure, the calm expression, the dignified expression, and also the naked body that's put together clearly for demonstration, for display, but also for a sense of wholeness, and the opposite of freakishness. How those different kind of modes are interacting, and maybe in a sense in conflict and in tension with each other. I think that's what we see in a lot of this work. I think my favorite thing is Monsters being the prime example. It also puts me in mind of traveled from, say, the late 90s when Charles Burns was putting out Black Hole, the ways in which Black Hole as a graphic novel is all about the monstrosity of contagion and the horrors of it, and the kind of sexualized and sensationalistic kind of aspects of it, typified here by this episode where one of the characters encounters himself in a dream, but it's him as a fully fledged contaminated monster. Oh God, who's that? Who do you think it is? It's you big dork, right? And so this brings us back to Canguilhem's notion about that it is only because humans are living creatures that a morphological mistake is to our living eyes a monster. The ways that monstrosity is in a sense natural and completely normal, in the sense that it is simply a part of how we reproduce, of how our cells are dividing, and how mutations are produced, and how there's always going to be variation. And so it's those kinds of ways of thinking about monstrosity as both cultural and morphological that I think are very, very key to my understanding. This brings me finally to Franklin, who is a minor character from Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters. He only appears a couple of times, at least in volume 1. And what fascinates me about Franklin is because he brings together all of these modes that I've mentioned. There's the Frankenstein's monster tradition. Only here he is a young Black man from the inner city of Chicago, who has various scars all over his face, and the way in which we have here an African-American Frankenstein's monster, if you will, also a disabled Frankenstein's monster, a figure that is also kind of filled with a sense of being represented with a sense of dignity and a sense of wholeness, because he is never in any kind of a lamenting mode over his disability. He seems to be comfortable with himself. The antagonism and the stigma always comes from the outside. And as Ferris puts it here, if all the pieces fell away, I got the idea that what was inside of him was kind of light, right? So there's a kind of beauty and even a kind of angelic sensibility here that's being put forth by the figure of Franklin. So in sum, I can say that as Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock puts it, the monster is, as Jeffrey Jerome Cohen appreciates, difference made flesh. It is the other, the not us, that which culture rejects, disowns, and disavows. But what this means is that to redefine monstrosity is simultaneously to rethink humanity. When our monsters change, it reflects that our understanding of what it means to be human, our relations with one another and to the world around us, our conception of our place in the greater scheme of things have changed as well. I would put forth that, again, over the last 30 years, and I think you can trace it through some of this material, we see a kind of reconfiguration of the monster, a greater embrace, I think on a very popular scale now, of the monstrous in all sorts of different modes. And I think a figure like Franklin from My Favorite Thing is Monsters is I think a primary kind of topos for exploring that particularly intersectional kind of mode of monstrosity further. And I just wanted to finish by bringing it back to Audre Lorde from her Litany for Survival, which I think speaks with a very quiet power to a lot of what I've been saying about monstrosity and its representation in comics. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And yet we did survive. And yet there is a kind of triumph in that all the same. I will stop there, I think.
Thank you very much, José, for such rich, insightful, and full of monstrous stories presentation. And let me just ask our audience if we need 5 minutes of break, and maybe you also need this 5 minutes, or can we go on?
I'm fine, but if you all want to take 5 minutes, it's okay.
Should I interpret the silence as encouragement to go on?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Okay, right. Okay, so let me maybe start with 3 or 4 question, and then I maybe leave the floor for the audience if you're fine with that construction of the discussion.
Yes, fine by me. And I left out one slide where
Okay. And my first question would reflect on the political or subversive power of the figure of monster.
Oh yeah.
The opportunities, but also the limitations that are embodied in the body of monster to represent the disability. Because on the one hand, I think historically, the monster figure through the means of the grotesque was often used to undermine the cultural notion of normality, beauty, propriety, and so-called norm. But on the other hand, this association between disability and deformity, morphological mistake, ugliness, and abnormality is so strong and taken for granted in culture that monstrosity in relation to disability seems very close to the stereotype and is rather too obvious than subversive. And I think that the question you raise also in the abstract of your lecture also disturbs me, because you asked the question, what does it mean for comics artists to explore the monstrous in an era of disability rights movement? And that would be my question. How can we use such figure, bearing in mind the political aims of disability rights movement and this problematic tradition of linking disability and monstrosity in the culture?
Thank you. No, that is, of course, a key question. Certainly, obviously, everything that I've been discussing relates to the political and the questions of greater visibility, greater representation for disabled people. I think that as I was trying to indicate in my last section, I think what a lot of these artists are doing and what some of these thinkers are doing is by redefining the monster, by reclaiming the monster, by cripping the monster in ways that I think we can liken to other historically marginalized and derogated groups like queer people, LGBTQ plus folks, who also, of course, were subject to a lot of stigma and a lot of stereotyping and a lot of other things, and then by kind of claiming more of that identity, claiming the term queer, for example, and by in some respects maybe leaning into some of that, and not hiding it or not trying to apologize for it or anything like that. I think Margaret Shildrick's work in particular, I didn't highlight her too much, but she talks about also the questions of how, of the other side of that equation is, of course, the notion of how monstrosity has historically been used as a way to kind of define normality, right? And so you abject all of these undesired characteristics. That's kind of what's going on in that Dove beauty campaign, I would argue, in a very banal way. But obviously it's a very obviously an affected campaign. But as Schildrick points out, there is this way in which we need to reconsider how to be human is also to carry an aspect of the monstrous within us as morphologically changeable beings, so to speak. So I think that it works, I think, on both of those levels. You're absolutely right, of course, that there is a great deal of baggage that comes with this notion of the monstrous, and I think that there's a great deal of room for debate. But I think all of the artists that I covered, whether it was Al Davison in The Spiral Cage, or Ken Dahl in Monsters, or Baban and Mashek in Damian Hobak, which is the most complicated case, you have a way in which that the monstrous is ultimately a kind of sense of something that has to be rather than denied or put under the rug or erased in some way, or somehow run away from, is something that ultimately needs to be accounted for and incorporated to a certain extent. Almost, I think, in a sense, as a kind of a kind of announcement of who one is, and a non-denial rather than denying. Excuse me. I hope that at least starts to answer some of your concerns.
Yes, thank you. And actually, my second question would also refer to a problematic tradition of metaphoralization of disability. And you talk about monstrosity as a kind of operative visual metaphor for illness, for example, and historical trauma. But at the same time, many scholars, for example, Leonard Davis, Rosemary Garland Thompson, or Tobin Siebers, or in Poland, Katarzyna Ojrzyńska and Justyna Wielgus, they point that disabled body is particularly trapped between two kinds of visuality: hypervisuality and invisibility. And when we look at a body with disability, very often we see either nothing but disability reduced to a very strong physical sign of deformation or just cultural difference, or something else than disability, a kind of metaphor for something else, more general, humanity, trauma, etc. So do you think that this metaphorization is rather something to overcome, or something that might be used as a way to build more realistic, more materialistic representations of a disabled body? Is this metaphorical stuff something that disturbs you, or rather something that promises you that this critical work can be done with this symbolic potential in that kind of representation?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Of course, yeah, I am very leery. This I'm putting here, going back to The Spiral Cage by Al Davison. No, of course, yes, there is, and I happen to know Katarzyna. I don't know if she's in the audience here, but there is a real concern, obviously, about the metaphorization kind of question. And I think it is happening probably to the greatest degree in the Czech example that I gave. And as far as I know, Baban and Mashek do not identify as disabled themselves. So that's that's something that I think I need to explore further. But in an example like Al Davison, who is a disabled artist and who is turning to the figure of the Frankenstein monster, I'm not sure that it's exactly metaphorization in his case. It's something. It's recognition. It's the recognition that we see also in Rivelair when she mentions in her interview, right, that it was the monster movies. It was Frankenstein. It was the Wolfman. It was the vampires, who were the ones that she would cheer on when she was a young girl, because they were the ones that reminded her of her. So there is a kind of identificatory sort of model here that is being pursued. But it's also, I think this is something that, of course, the Frankenstein monster is so useful because, of course, that's the way that Mary Shelley wrote him, right? She writes him as a kind of tragic figure who is being wronged by the world. And so, yes, even though he has this monstrous figure, if you will, this body, it's really the rest of the world that is the monstrous that are being the moral monsters, if you will. So I think in this page from the Spiral Cage, I think you can see, even in the way that the composition is laid out, right? The way that you have almost a kind of X figure that is shown from the top right panel there, and then the bottom right panel, and then the top right panel, the middle panel, and the bottom left panel. The way that forms almost a kind of target, and then that is being imbricated here by the pictures from the Shelley. For how he's visualizing Shelley's novel. It's really a sense in which he finds something for the first time that he is able to recognize in a work of art. It's also, by the way, something that Karen does in My Favorite Thing is Monsters, by looking at famous monsters in the magazines or at pictures or paintings in the museum that have monstrous figures. So it is a lot of this stuff that I think is, as you point out, has a very, very problematic history, and especially when we are metaphorizing, I think overtly, it does become a problem. At the time, I think is a very useful way of fueling a healthier, I would say, a more holistic sense of the stuff and of one's own difference, and of coming to maybe redefine what the monster can be is I think a lot of what these artists are engaged in. But it's never easy, and it's never straightforward. I will certainly say that.
Yes, and about the intersections, because this is something that really interests me in the construction of a disabled body. Do you see any patterns of interfusing, intersecting these disability and other cultural identity categories such as race, gender, sexuality, nation, religion, age, and so on? Because in your presentation, I saw, for example, a really interesting intersection between disability, monstrosity, and masculinity.
Yes.
Whereas usually I thought about this figure of monster as somehow feminized. And
right.
Yeah, and that
right.
was pretty surprising to me, and suggests me I need to rethink maybe this link I had in my mind between femininity, monstrosity, and disability. What can you say about this kind of intersection?
No, these are wonderful questions. Thank you. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think all of these figures ultimately are queering the masculine figure. I'm not sure that, of course, someone like Al Davison talks about himself as a man, and it's got some problems as a memoir, because it ultimately it's positioning him as a quote unquote real man, because he's to overcome to a certain degree his limitations, and he studies karate, and he's able to basically get into fights and win the fight. So there's all sorts of other kind of aspects there that I think need a little bit more critique. But a figure like Franklin from My Favorite Thing is Monsters that I have on the screen here, I think like I said, I think he embodies a very intersectional ethos about looking at people from many, many different aspects and what it is that they are. And one of them is going to be disabled, and one of them is going to be almost kind of literary in the sense that he physically is evoking so much of the Frankenstein monster just as in his look. But what's wonderful about this image is that it is an African American face. It is a black face. Of a version of the Frankenstein monster. That means that anybody can be the Frankenstein monster, right? That anything. And so things like gender do get, I think, subverted in sorts of ways. I think there is that's another way that some of these figures like Marina Levina talks about disability and monstrosity, is that they're both in a sense about queering the norm. So yeah, absolutely. I think I would follow you in seeing that it's sure there is this very long link with femininity, and partly I think it's coming out because scholars like Rosemary Garland Thompson are coming out of a feminist kind of perspective, which I think has been really key to disability studies. I think now with a more queer studies approach, or a cripping kind of approach, I think we start going into newer areas, more intersectional areas.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that Frankenstein context, because I wasn't aware that this figure might be somehow central for rethinking disability and corporality. But I also read a wonderful interpretation of Leonard Davies in his book translated by Magda into Polish. Interpretation of Frankenstein from the perspective of disability studies, and it really opens my my eyes for this kind of meaning. I wasn't aware that they are there, and yeah.
I was just going to say that there's a wonderful also instability to Frankenstein's monster, because, of course, it is a product of literary kind of culture of English literature of the early 19th century. But then it's also it's a popular figure, right? Many people know Frankenstein's monster through movies or through so many other media. So there's already this, in a sense, it's an intersectional kind of figure itself, since it seems to operate in so many different media modes.
Yes, exactly. And, this is also something interesting. What does popular culture do with these literary heroes? Because Leonard Davies shows perfectly how the filmmakers created actually the image of Frankenstein's monster as intellectually disabled, because contrary to Mary Shelley, who created the hero, the monster in her novel, as someone who is intellectually very very high, I would say. He reads a canon, he reads Blake, he reads he's beautiful as well, except for some small traces of death on his face, but he is not that disabled as the film shows. So this is the way how popular culture exaggerates somehow the monstrosity of that literary hero. So that this is also something interesting as a kind of cultural process.
Yes, it's interesting, and it's a symptom of visuality, right? It's how do we indicate the monstrosity? Of course, you're going to exaggerate physical features. That's why I think it's so important that Al in the hospital, he's reading Frankenstein. He's not watching the movies, and so it would have been interesting. I think it would be a very different scene if he were watching TV and that, like, the Frankenstein movie came on or something. But he's introduced to the figure through that very, very articulate, very intellectual figure of the monster that from Shelley's novel, not from the popular image. And of course, but of course, the drawings, because comics are of course drawn, and they're visual representations. The image that he gives us actually looks a lot like the Boris Karloff version from the early 1930s. So it's both, right? And again, we're back to that sort of tension and instability of what the figure actually really is. And in a sense, I think we all carry multiple kind of maybe contradictory versions of Frankenstein's monster.
Right, thanks. I have one more question, but maybe it's the high time to open the floor also for others. So
People, I'm sure,
if you have any questions, it's the moment to ask it. Kasia. Yep.
Thank you so much. Hello, Jose. It was great to see you, and your lecture was absolutely fascinating. And I would like to follow up on the what you call the intersectional mode of monstrosity, because when you discussed it, you mostly focused on other underprivileged groups and on humans. And it seems to me that this hybridity of a monster could be successfully used to kind of challenge or rethink the human-animal divide, and to bring together animal rights and disability justice. And I know that this has been a problematic topic for quite a long time, and there's been some animosity because of, well, for instance, Peter Singer and so on and so forth. But then there are Sonora Taylor, Eli Clare, and in visual arts, I think also Riva Lehrer in some ways bring these two perspectives together. But I was wondering if you have found any attempts of bringing these two perspectives together in graphic novel and comics, and using in the figure of a monster, right?
Well, that's a brilliant question from a brilliant scholar, and it's lovely to see you, Katarzyna. Yeah, it's a wonderful topic that I've explored. I mean, yes, there are a number of comics that are looking at questions of hybridity and animal-human kind of mashups, if you will. I've not really written about them so much, but I do think that actually the monster, as you obviously point out very, very astutely, the monster is already kind of doing some of that. I mean, that's what this is in Emil Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters. When Karen represents herself as a werewolf, of course, there's animal anatomy that is being accessed. And again, comics can in very explicit and productive ways. I do have my own story about the problematic nature of how fraught and vexed these questions can be, because I'm also someone who does critical animal studies, I happened to be at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., and as many of you know, I'm sure Gallaudet is a very, very respected, lauded institution for the deaf. And I happened to be there in the summer of 2018 when Coco, the gorilla who uses sign language, famously in California, that Coco died. Coco was like in her 40s, and she died. And so I had always been fascinated by Coco, and just since I was a kid. And I mentioned this to some of my colleagues there, and I did not know this, that I didn't know that Coco was a very controversial figure among the deaf community. And they explained to me in a lot of detail why Coco was a very bad figure for deaf people, because it makes hearing people think that sign language is so simplistic that even a dumb animal can master it, and therefore, sign language isn't really a real language, blah, 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 all of those things. So it was a fascinating discussion and an opening. That said, right, I mean, a lot of that discussion a lot of that discourse from my colleagues, it went very quickly into anthropomorphism. It went very quickly into this idea that, that animals can't communicate, or animals are not, because they kind of needed or felt they needed to say that, because otherwise it seemed to compromise their own position. So I've actually written a little bit about this. I'm happy to send it to you if you're interested, because I thought it was a fascinating kind of, again, clash of these different views.
Yeah, another thing is, well, another question is, do the authors of the works that you've discussed identify themselves as disabled?
Well, I mean, in the case of Ken Dahl, who of course has the herpes, and it's a graphic memoir. In the case of Emile Ferris, she does identify as disabled, and as also Latina, and also as a lesbian. So there's a lot of there that she's been very open about discussing all of that. And then but yeah, some of this is not, and so some of this is either material that I might want to fold into a different project, as Baban and Mashek do not, as far as I know. And so they're the ones that are using it in the most, argue, kind of metaphorical, problematic ways. Yeah, I would be more than happy to hear feedback or suggestions for how maybe to streamline this material or maybe alter it in some way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely to see you.
Me too.
I think I have
There's a question from
Magdalena.
Heather.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very, very rich presentation, and I really enjoyed it, as well as the discussion afterwards. And I have a question. If you could position this reclaiming of the monster by the disability discourse in a wider landscape of what was happening in the popular culture, in this larger scale, like for example with counterculture, with seeing the gangster or the of the outsider as this figure that is reclaimed by the cinema, for example, as a positive figure, or the figure that we can identify with. Do you see any link with this? Because clearly right now we can see characters that are presented maybe not as disabled, but as vulnerable, on monstrous in a way, as representing the everyman, or every woman, like a citizen, with The Last Joker, for example, being a troubling but still an interesting example.
Well, I think Leslie Fiedler, right, very famously was doing this a long time back in the 60s, talking about freaks, talk about this as he was arguing this way in which to be a freak was actually a very positive thing among the hippie and among the counterculture in the 1960s and 70s. And so again, a kind of revalorization, a redefinition, a kind of sense of claiming. Now, of course, he's doing this from a perspective of more of an able-bodied, I think, man. But there is, I think, maybe the other danger, of course, right, is that you start to, in a sense, create a kind of imagined, sort of pure sort of figure that is itself dehumanizing in a certain way. And so, and we get back to the problem of metaphorization that Monica pointed out before. What I find really generative and productive about these representations, particularly like the work of someone like Emile Ferris or Ken Dahl or Al Davison, is that they themselves, I think, are very consciously and very, I think, self-critically, I think, adapting this kind of imagery, the monstrous figure, and using it for a kind of rehabilitative purpose, to rehabilitate the monster, to kind of have us rethink what the monster can be and how monstrosity is in a sense something to be embraced. And at the same time, they are, I think, kind of widening that sphere of what's the word of qualified humanity, right? It's Leonard Davis, or I forget exactly who says it, but that disability has always been seen as the disqualifying category. And so to make it less disqualifying or not disqualifying at all by doing it through monsters. And so, yes, I think Leslie Fiedler was doing that kind of work decades ago. And I think you're right. Now, a lot of the popular culture, so much of the popular culture, and a lot of this I don't delve into myself. I try to stay in comics, but things like all the vampire series, TV shows, and movies, and there's been a real revalorization of the vampire as a romantic figure, right? Even an explicitly erotic figure, which was always there, going back Bram Stoker at least, but it's become much more prominent. Serial killers, even zombies, some of them become more heroic figures. And so, yeah, I think you are seeing a lot of that. Partly, I think, because it's being driven by communities who want that sort of stuff, but also I think it's by the market. I think there's a lot that you can do by rebranding these older figures like the monsters and having them be more complex figures. But it's good for business too, on top of everything else. That's maybe not the answer that you were looking for. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else?
We've got one question in chat, so maybe I will read it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I have. Oh, yeah. I think I see. I can read it out. Do you think that the concept of dignity evoked by monstrosity refers to the cyborg figure as well? If you mean like the cyborg figure as discussed by Donna Haraway, or more the sci-fi, I mean, obviously there's overlap there. I would think so, yes, because both are figures of hybridity and of mixing and of crossing various kind of corporeal and ideological, political borders, I would say. And sure, I think the cyborg is a variation of these kinds of questions. I mean, if you want to look at a figure like, I don't know, the Terminator or something, and again, right, that gets us back to an evolution where the Terminator figure in the first film begins as a villain, as a monstrous figure that's there to kill everybody, but then by the second film and later it becomes a kind of heroic figure. So there's been a kind of shift in that assessment. So if that's a useful answer, I hope I hope it was useful. Hello?
Yes, anyone else would like to ask?
Oh. Sorry, I just thought I had lost you.
Yeah, I'm here.
Maybe people want to start their weekend.
Let me just wait for someone who would like to ask one more question.
Okay.
If I may ask the final question. Yes, do we have, Magda, do we have time to ask one more question? The last question from me would be about differences between mainstream culture and alternative culture, because I would like to have a kind of perspective. How do the typical representation of a disabled body differ when we take into consideration differences between mainstream culture and alternative culture? I guess that these kind of representations you showed us today would rather not been popular in super hero comic like Marvel, for example, or maybe I'm wrong. So if you could just say a bit more about these two kinds of representation, mainstream representation of disabled body and this alternative representation of disabled body.
Well, I don't think I need to speak too much about mainstream, since most people I think already know it. I mean, my second book, Death, Disability, and the Superhero, The Silver Age and Beyond, is basically an exploration of the evolving depiction of disabled people in mainstream superhero comics from the late 1950s into the 1990s. And the things like the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 in the United States were obviously very important to bring visibility to the the discrimination against disabled people and their greater incorporation into the workforce, et cetera, et cetera. It's still very, very imperfectly enforced, and there's all sorts of problems. But I would argue that at least in our very neoliberal moment of late capitalism, there is a kind of, as we put it, lip service that is given, a kind of tokenism very often that you will see in advertisements, in movies. Like you see more people in wheelchairs, more people that are being shown that are visibly disabled. It's a little harder when you're dealing with invisible disability, I would argue, but there's been TV shows about autistic people, and there's been other things like that. But it's I think that the general perception, at least from my own interactions with people who watch some of these things and who are disabled, is that it still feels largely kind of token, like tokenism. I guess the best example, and I never watched this show, but about 10 years ago there was Glee, the musical show on television, and that had a disabled character, but the disabled character was played by a person with who was not disabled. So and at one point he starts dancing. He gets out of his wheelchair and starts dancing. So yeah, that it's still there. Yes, these sorts of things are, of course, the things that I'm analyzing are in alternative comics, therefore more of a niche audience. And my apologies, I've just noticed that maybe I might be running out of battery, even though I thought I was connected. So I may just disappear. So sorry about that. I think we've mostly gotten to the end, I think.
I think so. So thank you very much.
To get out of the question.
That was a sign from that technology. Thank you very much, José.
Yes, lovely, and thank you again for the invitation. And I hope to meet maybe, and I'd love to attend your conference one of these years. That'd be wonderful.
Yes, that would be great. And sorry once again for not being seen today, but it's really Murphy's Law. So that's all from me. All the best in New Year. And
yes,
for the Christmas or winter holiday time.
Yes, the same to you all. Have a wonderful break. And let's hope for better things in the new year in all sorts of areas.
Yes. Thank you very much, José. Thank you, Monica, and thank you all for being with us. And have a great winter holiday and Christmas. And see you in February. And remember about our conference. It's a communicat for everyone here.